Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Mike Gibb. I run accountsrecovery.net, and I want to welcome you to today's webinar on what qualifies as a discussion under 7 and 7. Under Regulation F, the CFPB's debt collection rule, collectors are limited to the number of phone call attempts and conversations that can be had with consumers. But what constitutes a discussion? And what about other circumstances where collectors are allowed to call outside of the 7 and 7 prohibitions? Today in this webinar, which is being sponsored by TCN, we have a panel of legal and compliance experts here to discuss what constitutes a discussion and how collectors should address the situation as they build their compliance policies and procedures under Regulation F. Before introducing the panel, though, I did want to take a quick second to talk about the accountsrecovery.net Slack channel. I just dropped the link in the chat window for anybody if you haven't joined yet. We're I think 598 members. So if you join now, you might be the lucky 600th member on the channel. If you're not using it, Slack, think of it like a big chat room for the industry. So it's a chance for people to stay connected, engage and network with one another, get questions and answers. It's a great way to sort of stay in touch with everybody in the industry. So I encourage you to join if you haven't already done so. Now let me introduce you to today's panelists. Mike Frost is a partner at Malone Frost Martin. He leads the firm's regulatory, compliance, and virtual general counsel services. Mike provides counsel, consultation, complex transactional, and litigation defense services to collection agencies, law firms, credit reporting agencies, data providers, creditors, and various other businesses focused in the accounts receivable management industry. Mike served on ACA International's board of directors for 2 consecutive terms and received the Unit Leader of the Year award in 2013, the Member Attorney Program Designee in 2014, the Judicial Advocacy Award in 2018, and Member of the Year in 2019. Stephanie Jackman is the leader of Ballard Spahr's debt collection team and a partner located in Ballard's Atlanta office. Stephanie's nationally recognized for her expertise in collections, compliance, and litigation across all segments of the financial services industry, including traditional financial products, fintech, and healthcare, online lending, and student lending. John Redding is a partner at Alston & Bird and a member of the firm's consumer financial services team. He regularly advises banks, auto finance companies, private equity firms, loan servicers, and debt purchasers and collectors on regulatory compliance and enforcement matters involving the CFPB, Department of Justice, FTC, and other state and federal regulatory and enforcement agencies. John served as general counsel and associate general counsel to several financial services and software companies where he managed large-scale litigation and supervised regulatory compliance, loan origination, servicing, and debt collection matters. Lauren Valenzuela is corporate counsel at Performant Recovery, where she advises on compliance with consumer protection laws, government regulation, licensing, litigation defense, and transactional matters. She currently serves on ACA's judicial and MAP committees and is an ACA certified credit and collection compliance attorney. Prior to joining Performant, she was general counsel and director of compliance for Collection Technology Incorporated. The format for today's webinar is going to be our usual panel discussion. We encourage everybody to submit questions and we'll get to them during the course of our discussion. To submit a question, you can do so either through the Q&A tab on your Zoom webinar control panel, or you can send it to us through the chat module. Since we're going to be talking about compliance today, let me read the following disclaimer. This presentation is not intended to be legal advice and may not be used as legal advice. Legal advice must be tailored to the specific circumstances of each case. Every effort has been made to ensure this information is up to date. It is not intended to be a full and exhaustive explanation of the law in any area. It should never be used to replace the advice of your own legal counsel. Didn't have to look at the script once for that disclaimer today, which means it's going to be a good day. All right, let's bring our panel here today, which is why everybody has signed up and looking for this information on this topic. So when we talk about 7 and 7, let's sort of first set the table and talk about what we mean. And I'm going to pick on Lauren because she's the only one who's not muted right now to go first.
All right, well, thanks, Mike. So when we talk about the 7 and 7 and 7 rule, what we're referring to is under Regulation F, the Bureau essentially told us that there will be a presumption of compliance under 1692D of the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, where if a debt collector makes no more than 7 phone calls within 7 consecutive days, and if a debt collector has a telephone conversation with a person, they do not call again for a period of 7 consecutive days after having that telephone conversation. So that's where we get the 7 and 7 and 7, I guess you could say, rule from. And then you should note that the date of the telephone conversation is the first day of the 7 consecutive day period. And I would also like to note that the 7 and 7 and 7 rule not only applies to calls to consumers, but also to third parties.
Okay, thanks, Lauren. Stephanie, Mike, John, anything else you want to add on top of what we start with our starting point for discussing what 7 and 7 and 7 is, or are we ready to move on? I'm going to take that as we're ready to move on. All right, so let's talk about what the limits are on conversations that can be had with consumers under Regulation F, because there are some situations where you're allowed to sort of go outside of the number of call attempts or outside the number of conversations in terms of what exceptions are allowed. And John, we'll let you walk us through those.
Sure, thanks, Mike. And so, it's, well, we're going to talk about it a little bit later. It's important to note that these limitations are per debt limits and not necessarily per consumer limits. But in terms of some of the exceptions, any calls that are made with the consent of the consumer and within 7 days of receiving that consent are perfectly acceptable. So therefore can be beyond the 7-day limit. Also, to the extent a call is placed, but we don't end up connecting with the number that's been dialed, that call won't count toward the 7 and 7 day limit. And then there are certain professionals to whom calls can be placed that will not count toward the limit. So, some of them I think make perfect sense. You start thinking about having a communication with the consumer's attorney or the creditor, the creditor's attorney, the collector's attorney. None of those types of calls are going to count. One of the things to be careful of is that limited content messages are not an exception. And so this is something we'll touch on later. The other types of exceptions to the limitation that can come into play are those calls that are placed to comply with some applicable law. So if there's some type of call requirement outside debt collection that requires us to place a call, then that is a permitted call and not part of the 7. Similarly, anything relating to, say, an active litigation. And you start thinking about you're in litigation and you're going to have a call to talk about negotiating a settlement of that litigation. None of those are going to count toward the 7. And then similarly, of course, any response to the consumer, or the last one that comes to mind immediately is a call that is placed to the consumer to avoid a negative impact. So for instance, imagine you've entered into a payment plan with the consumer, you're at your limit, but assume you're at the very last day that they have to submit the particular installment under the payment plan, or it's going to all accelerate to be due in full tomorrow. That type of call would also be permitted as an exception to the limit.
Now, it seems as you were going through that list, there are some areas that are not necessarily objective and sort of they're subjective in terms of, you talked about like a negative impact. Is that something that's defined by the CFPB, or is that something that is left up to an agency to determine what would constitute a negative impact?
It's a little bit of both. It's not expressly defined within the rule itself. So, but instead, if you go and look at the examples that are set forth in the commentary, they do a decent job of laying out some of the examples.
Yeah, I would also like to add that what John was saying, to help the consumer avoid a negative impact, the official interpretation in Part 1 makes it really clear that there must be evidence to back that up. So there must be some type of evidentiary support to show, the collector has to show that, yes, this was some type of harm, time was of the essence, and that it was outside of the debt collector's control. So if it's some type of manufactured emergency that the debt collector created, that will not, you cannot use that exception essentially. And the Bureau makes really clear that these are things that will allow you to rebut the presumption positively, meaning you can say, hey, our call exceeded 7, it was 8 calls in a week, but we had a justifiable reason, and we're going to rebut the presumption to show that it wasn't in violation of the law. So just something to note about that one in particular.
There was a question that came in. Is credit reporting on a defaulted loan considered a negative impact?
So I would say that it could be, but remember, you need to show that that the debt collector didn't have any type of control or influence over that credit reporting or the timing of it, and that time was of the essence. So for example, if the creditor client has some type of policy or procedure that was going to cause credit reporting on a particular date that's outside of the collector's control, then maybe the collector could show, hey, this falls within this exception.
And I think one of the areas, this would be an area I'd certainly exercise caution, recognizing that credit reporting is one of those things that is done on a cycle. And so, is it really an emergency if, for instance, I knew 5 days earlier that it was going to be on a particular date? Does waiting until a shorter time period create an emergency, and would that be sufficient? And given the changes that we've seen at the Bureau and expectations at the CFPB in particular relative to how they're going to be approaching debt collection and so many other things, I'd be a little concerned about them viewing that as something of a created emergency or something that could have been avoided. But I think it's it's an option.
And the litigation, John or Lauren mentioned a few minutes ago too, is, you have a rebuttable presumption now. So there's going to be a presumption by the court that if you made more than 7 attempts, that you violated the rule. So it was intent. It was an intent-based statute. So that are pretty significant. So to John's point, you should, consider going over that allotted number of call attempts. You would make, that exemption and allow yourself to make that additional attempt.
Okay, a few more questions come in. One, does the one conversation limit apply where a consumer places an inbound call to the debt collector? Does that count?
Absolutely counts. It doesn't count for the 7 outward attempts, but it does count as the one conversation from which the 7 consecutive day post communication will be measured. And the Bureau's made that very clear. Again, within the commentary, they spell that out.
Okay. Another credit reporting question: isn't credit reporting exempt from a communication anyway?
So I think the answer is yes, when communicating to the credit reporting agency. Communicating about credit reporting when done for purposes of, seeking to get the consumer to pay. I suspect that type of communication, and depending upon how that conversation goes, could be considered a communication.
Stephanie, one of the exceptions that John mentioned was, if you have the consumer's consent, you can kind of go beyond the one conversation in 7 days. Does that lend itself to collectors sort of asking on every conversation, do I have your permission to consent to call you back, or sort of stay in touch beyond that 7 days? Or is that something that just might get a little too unwieldy?
It's an interesting scenario you pose. I don't think it's likely aligned with what the Bureau was intending in saying that you could return a request to call back. Because remember, one of the driving forces of this provision, among others, is to put consumers in the driver's seat about how, when why, through what channels they're contacted, whether which is a change. These are consumers who've been unable to pay back an obligation they often voluntarily, not always. I mean, I know sometimes medical can get tricky, but voluntarily took on, and now you're having your ability to communicate with them challenged. So I think the CFPB might find that scripting around at every time, may I have permission to call you again, to not be aligned with how I read the rule and the commentary around more thinking about in other instances where, getting consent, for instance, to email or text, it can't be in the communication itself that wasn't authorized. Like if a consumer texts you and you don't, previously they said, don't text me, you can't get consent to start texting them again in that particular text communication. You have to get it separately on something you're otherwise allowed to do. So thinking about those principles, I think the Bureau would take issue with it. I also think it would be unwieldy. It's going to be difficult enough to keep track of all these things. It's going to be difficult to figure out what are the attempts. And then when we have a communication, is it a communication that counts? What is that? The Bureau didn't maybe give as much guidance as some of us might have liked. So if we're then adding in scripting, just presumptive, can I call you back for no particular reason? In the current environment, I don't know that the Bureau would be okay with that. Now, does that mean that there's opportunities to defend back and say it's defensible? Sure. Will we want to be doing that? Is that the direction we want to go in? My instinct is probably not.
I will add, this is a really nuanced thing because, for example, in the official interpretation section, the Bureau makes clear, they give us some examples and they say, hey, if you talk to a consumer on Monday and the consumer says, call me back on Wednesday, that would say, hey, we have the prior express consent. They gave us a day to call back. Great. Now let's do another scenario that's similar and says, let's say you talk to the consumer on Monday and they say, I'm busy right now, call me later. And they don't give you a time or a day to call back. The examples that the Bureau provides us suggest that you cannot call back unless you ask them, is there a particular day or time I could call you back? So it's really nuanced, and I think we're going to have to really think as an industry how to train our collectors to properly navigate those situations. Because like Stephanie said, to proactively ask it and to put it as a default in your script, maybe not such a good idea. However, when you do have a consumer who says, I want to talk about this, I can't talk now, call me later, at that point, we should have something in place where our collectors can maybe ask, is there a particular time or a day or something, how to navigate that situation? Because in that situation, the consumer has expressed, hey, I want to talk about this. So it is nuanced, very nuanced, and we're all going to have to really think about how we best train and equip collectors to navigate those situations going forward.
Well, and it's part of why, as we're also, I know we're here talking about calls, but as we're developing platforms to assist with online engagement, text, email, online payment portals, whatever we're doing, right? Continuing to think about, are there opportunities to give consumers the keys, right? The CFPB wants them in the driver's seat, so give them the keys. Does it make sense? And again, I know this feels very, very different because it is different from how we've approached this in the past. This isn't going anywhere anytime soon. Does it make sense to start asking consumers? You have a pop-up. Here's the email we have for you. And are there particular times that it would be useful for you to get a text or a call? Like, give them the ability to give you a roadmap of when to contact them. There are system functionalities that can be built in, even if you're just reaffirming consent to contact them. I understand we're not necessarily required, right? I get that. I'm not trying to, but still, is it better if you get challenged to show that every time they logged onto your portal, they were updating, saying, yeah, all this looks good. I still don't want you to text me. Email's still cool. Here's my email address. There's benefit to this if we can get our heads around it and get past the discomfort of it achieving exactly what the Bureau wants, putting the consumer in the driver's seat, which means sometimes they're going to shut it down.
Well, and I think too, both Stephanie and Lauren have raised a couple really good points. As Stephanie said, if you're scripting it for no particular, you're scripting to call them back for no particular reason, I agree. That's going to be a harder, sell as on the defense side. certainly in the enforcement context. Mike, I know, can speak to the litigation context. And so I think that doing it everywhere is going to be challenging from a bureau perspective. At the same time, you know, if you're having a conversation with somebody and either they need to gather information, you need to gather information, whatever's going on there, and as a result, you ask to, can I call you back tomorrow? Can I call you back in the next couple days? Once I've got that information, to the point I think Lauren was making, that makes a lot more sense. And again, you know, I always tend to go back to the rules, and particularly the commentary in the rules, because I think there's a lot of good information in there. And the Bureau even contemplates the very kinds of questions that Lauren was talking about. So, you know, I certainly think it can be done in arming collectors with not just what to say, but when. And what are the scenarios in which it's going to be found to be acceptable? I think all of those are going to be really important. And if a collector is asking in every single conversation, can I call you back? And without being specific, and there's no particular reason for it, I think you are going to see some challenges to that.
Yeah, and I think it becomes difficult to defend it too, to your point, John. You know, if it's scripted on every call and there's not some leading behavior that requires, you know, that additional request, then it's really going to be, plaintiffs' counsel are going to look at it from a perspective of, hey, they're just setting this, circumvent the regulation and overcome that, and it's not truly an exemption. So I think those arguments on the plaintiffs' counsel side would become easier for them if it's set up on everyone. Now it could be, you know, a lot of times when we created scripting, we would use rebuttals and things like that. And one of the things would be if a consumer asks you a question about a specific issue and that opens the opportunity to allow for additional, you know, communication attempts, you know, then that, like you guys have all indicated, I think you could probably script that in just so it's not after mini Miranda. Hey, this is an attempt to collect a debt by a debt collector. Any information obtained will be used for that purpose. Can I call you back tomorrow? That's not something that we probably want to. It probably can fall in there somewhere without running afoul of the rule.
Okay, I'm just going to hit the pause button briefly on our discussion. I'd like to say a few words about TCN, the sponsor of today's webinar. TCN is a global provider of comprehensive cloud-based call center platform for enterprises, contact centers, BPOs, and collection agencies. Last week, it announced the launch of TCN Operator, the next generation of its flagship platform. Built for the modern call center, TCN Operator features an intuitive interface and comprehensive set of easy-to-use automated agent tools and advanced apps that all work together to boost agent productivity and improve customer experience. TCN Operator's features include omni-channel communications via voice, email, SMS, and text that provide a seamless, unified experience for call center agents to interact with consumers, business intelligence, reporting, and analytics that provide a 360-degree view of a call center operations to identify anomalies or trends and generate actionable insights, data management and compliance tools that ensure adherence to the TCPA, FDCPA, and other state and federal regulations, including new and updated debt collection rules issued by the CFPB, workforce engagement to manage all aspects of call center operations, including scheduling, forecasting, onboarding and training, evaluating performance and productivity, resolving agent-consumer conflicts, and documenting compliance, seamless integration and automation with third-party services and applications. Grounded in TCN's deep understanding of call center needs, TCN Operator is built on the company's vast experience in supporting billions of interactions every year between call center agents and consumers. I'm going to put a link in the chat window for everyone to click on to learn more about TCN Operator today. And thanks again to TCN for sponsoring today's webinar. All right, a couple of other questions that have come in here. Let's see here. We've got a scenario. Consumer makes an inbound call, has a discussion with an agent. The agent needs to obtain more information. That will take a day or so. The agent obtains consent from the consumer to return the call tomorrow with additional information requested. Is that an allowable exemption?
Yeah, and I responded in the chat group already, but I think it is. I think that's exactly the exemption that the CFPB is suggesting is, you know, if there's something that's going to provide additional information to a consumer, or there's some reason for that communication to continue and you are prohibited in that 7-day period, they didn't want that to negatively impact the consumer, and providing them additional information is exactly that. You're trying to provide them additional information that may help them figure out what they need to do on that account. So I think that's really, I believe that's really a great example of what the CFPB was trying to get at with their model.
I agree.
Sorry about that. Another question, in most CRMs, you can schedule a call back to a consumer. You would want to ask the consumer, okay, I understand you are busy right now. I'd like to schedule a good time to call back. What works best for you? I'm guessing the question is that okay?
Well, no, I think it might have actually been a reaction to when I was talking about the ability to get programming or technology that can help facilitate giving the consumer the communication keys. You know, I think that you could give them that opportunity to schedule a callback if they'd like it again. And I think it would be defensible that it's their option, right? You're not telling them it's required. Is there a time that would work better for you? And the more that we can just embrace the ability to use technology and systemic items to monitor what is going to be, I think, a more taxing approach. And by that, I mean, I think Lauren and John were saying earlier, there can be a lot of nuances here in figuring out what's the right step to arm your agents with to handle when a consumer says this or this or this, or says, I can't talk right now. You politely invite them to schedule a time or tell them that they can come out and tell you a good time and they never do, and how to treat that. Call analytics, you know, script compliance, being able to also, though, not just monitor your script compliance, but pull out if there were calls where somebody said, I can't talk right now. And using that to drive, as you look forward, how you can improve your operational processes and improve your training, have more regular training with your agents about different scenarios, right? Many companies have, the teams will have weekly meetings where they're talking to their managers and they're kind of going through scenarios and just, I forget what they call different things at different places. That's a great opportunity to start surfacing some of how would you have handled this? And did you know about this option to route them here, or here's a different way to come at it. Technology can help us, even though there's an initial outlay of expense. Technology can help us track and keep track of all the things that I think the Bureau wants us to keep track of. And to me, it's a really necessary investment right now to be able to implement and comply, however your individual organization decides to do that, with Reg F when it finally gets published, which is looking more like January 29th.
And these examples, you know, it's a spectrum, and you have to figure out where your risk tolerance is on that spectrum as well. You know, on one end of the spectrum, the consumer affirmatively asks you to call them back. On the other end of the spectrum, we've been talking about, you script every call to ask if you can call them back. And, you know, you have to figure out where you are on that spectrum. In this question, part of the underlying assumption is, I know you're busy. Okay, so there's something in that conversation that says, I can't talk right now, something like that. They're not trying to necessarily stop the conversation, just they can't have it now. Am I comfortable at that point with scripting? And I think to that point, you know, the other aspect of this that gets very important, and Lauren raised this earlier, is the evidence that you have to help you get beyond that presumption. And just making sure, whatever it is you're relying on to have that exemption, that somehow it's being documented in a way that is readily understandable. So somebody looking at it says, okay, I see why we took that position. And all of those things, I think, can be very helpful. But it does come down to frequently just, what is your risk tolerance on this spectrum, and how far are you willing to go with it?
Okay, another question. If we receive permission to call back to give more information, but the consumer doesn't answer the phone at the agreed upon time, can we call again within the 7 days to attempt to reach the consumer?
My instinct is, in that circumstance, assuming you've already hit your 7 attempts in 7 days, the rule reads that you get to contact them once in response. And I'm not recalling, I haven't memorized every word, and probably maybe some of you have, but I'm not recalling an example in this situation. So I would err on the side of, they didn't answer. They're in the driver's seat. Maybe they changed their mind. So if you're operating as this is an extra allowed response and they don't answer, you know, there's risk. Now, Mike, you're down here on my screen, looking at you, you might be able to still make an argument in litigation to defend it as consistent with giving him, I mean, I get that. It just depends on where you are. So if I'm building my approach, that might be one where that one goes on pause until I can start calling again on my 7-day waiting period, or get to day 8 and it starts over again if I haven't yet had a successful communication. But I welcome other people's thoughts, but that's my reaction, and then save the arguments that Mike makes for when something goes wrong. You know, the process breaks, a mistake happens. These things that's just the reality, and use it as a defensive argument that what you did was okay. I just wouldn't build a compliance approach on it.
I think an interesting thing too is you could consider one of the alternative communication methods. You know, right now there's not a limitation or prohibition on electronic communications through email, text. You know, if you want to take this a more conservative approach, do you say, all right, they didn't answer at that time window, I'm going to send an email or a text noting that I called you back at the time you asked, please give me a call. That's one way to go at that. Alternatively, you know, it's some of the examples in the commentary seem to imply that if you don't have a very specific time, maybe you can just call back within that 7-day period, you know, remembering that you've had a conversation. So again, and I think Stephanie was going there, it's a combination of risk tolerance, but do keep in mind, while we're talking telephone here, there are alternative communication methods that are provided for in the rule that might help us trigger them calling us back.
Yeah, I agree with both Stephanie and John on this one, but I think the one thing, it's the number of times that you attempt back. Issues, whether it's on the compliance level or in court, you know, dealing with, even if it does go through this rebuttable presumption and you have to argue that it's not, intent's still part of the rule. The CFPB does not have the ability to rewrite the statute. And the statute still has an intent piece on it. So while that have an example, or you have reasonable needs to get back a hold of the consumer, it doesn't mean, hey, dial them another 7 times today because they didn't reach the phone. You know, they told you to call them back at 8 o'clock in the morning. You called them at 8 and they didn't answer that day because I had to get a hold of them. That's obviously going to be something that's probably going to be perceived as by a court. Some courts have allowed 7 call attempts in one day. And I've litigated that case in the past where we've had 7 call attempts in 30 days and we've won those cases. But it all goes back to the fact of whether it's a text message, and even though text and email and all those different components are not considered in that 7 and 7, the court is going to look at this in totality based on intent. Not to get a hold of the consumer. The intent is to annoy them until they contact you or until you are able to get a hold of them. Then you're going to probably run afoul of the rule. But I think that's the key is, yeah, could it be that switch and bait issue where, hey, that one additional attempt is considered a violation? We're going to get into court on it. And at that point, you guys all know you lose because you're going to spend $20,000 to go and litigate a case. So it's, at the end of the day, it's, you know, it's to Stephanie's point earlier, the cautious process in the 7 and 7 rule away from those pre-litigation demands. And that's where you want to be.
Yeah, I love John's suggestion of leveraging the other communication methods. I think a lot of agencies are call heavy. They rely on calls law, and we have to recognize as an industry that essentially, you know, people aren't picking up their calls. There's call blocking. That's another issue, another webinar. There's now the 7 and 7 rule. We need to look holistically on how we get in contact and communicate most effectively with consumers. I will add to this discussion and just say that the Bureau also makes very clear in its official interpretations that you can still follow the 7 and 7 and 7 rule, yet violate, essentially, someone can rebut that presumption if there's other activities that the debt collector does. For example, if you email that person every single day, but you still follow the 7 and 7, well, that could lend itself to possibly showing that collector had intent to harass. So you have to really be careful, look at your holistic collection strategy, your holistic communication strategy, and make sure that you aren't creating any patterns or having any contacts at frequencies that could lend itself to saying, hey, they had intent to harass. So just something to think about as you kind of craft your policies and your procedures and your system controls is not only do you have to look at your call attempts outbound and inbound, but also look at your other communication strategies, whether that's sending a letter, sending an email, sending a text message, and making sure you aren't creating any type of communication patterns that could be seen as harassment.
Yeah, and sorry, just to add to this, everybody knows I'm a fan of text, and for good reason. But when you think about that, and you have a 12x higher probability of a contact than a phone call, you absolutely make that text outbound and see if you can't generate either an inbound call or response through text. And I think that's where your point is very, very well taken, Lauren, is you have to think of this in totality. It's your entire communication attempt with consumers, not just the 7 and 7 from an outbound dialing perspective. And I think that's something we have to try to get away from as an industry. Is as far as I can think back, as I was on the phones, I was always thinking about how, dialing is going to get me contacts, and that's not really true today. It was 15 years ago, but today it's really not. The fewer call attempts, I mean, there's been an awful lot of studies I've been involved in, analysis about, how many call attempts to get to RPC. And we found out over the years that number has considerably reduced over the years. When we first made some call attempts, we would look at how many call attempts does it take to get to RPC to that one specific phone number, and should you stop after a period of time? And I know that's in that 20 to 30 range today. You're making 20 call attempts to a consumer and you haven't tried anything but call, why make an additional phone call? Why not try a text? Why not try an email? Why not try something that's probably going to generate some consumer behavior different than what you're attempting to do? I think the old adage is, what's the definition of insanity? Doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result? Well, quit just dialing all the time. Do something different. Try to generate some type of a behavior or response from the consumer.
There was a question above, and Mike Gibbs secretly suggested that I take the lead on answering it. And it was, are direct voicemail drops considered a contact within the 7 and 7? Absolutely, they are considered an attempt. So they count for purposes of that 7 call attempts in 7 days. Do they count as a successful communication that triggers the 7-day waiting period? No. The CFPB was very clear, and there's some discussion about whether these should have been exempted, and we can argue about it, but the reality is they didn't exempt it from a call attempt count, but did say a one-way voicemail that's being left, like a ringless voicemail, does not trigger the waiting period. So it's not being treated as like a successful conversation or communication. So query a couple things there, because on the one hand, using that type of technology, whether that technology is putting a live person into the voicemail or sending a pre-recorded message, which I'll come back to in just a sec, that's one way to standardize. To Mike's point, is it worth like investing all this time in calls? Are we really getting the bang for our buck? Let's focus on other technology. Then we can just standardize that. We know what everything is, what we're saying. But keep in mind, as much as we're all enjoying the TCPA landscape shifting, pre-recorded messages are not reduced by Facebook. So in using that technology, there's a lot of opportunities, I think, to really build it into a process that's compliant and easier to oversee with your outbound efforts. But if it's delivering a pre-recorded message, you still have to remember the TCPA is not gone there, unfortunately. So just be thoughtful, but there may be large swaths of accounts where you feel comfortable, and that can drive down what your agents are having to do. They're not making outbound calls. You don't reduce your call QA. You can have your agents ready for inbound communications that might be in response to those types of messages that could say, these are our hours and we're ready to talk to you and call us back. There's also online. I mean, there's lots of ways to drive consumers to you, which I think all of us are saying is ultimately, if you can achieve that, that's kind of the best case scenario.
I agree totally with you on that piece. The one thing that's interesting to me is I've heard a lot of discussions around what really constitutes, a call attempt. If you get a busy signal, is that really a call attempt? Because the phone number never would have rang, right? So you would have never rang the phone. So would you call that a call attempt or not? I mean, arguably it's still out there. I hear a lot of people saying probably not a call attempt if it's a busy signal, because there's no way for it to have ever connected. And then you think about those direct drop messages and they don't ring the phone. So is that really a little bit more discussion, the CFPB's review about, the drop messages without the phone ring. But it's just an interesting dynamic when you think about that is, if you're not going to count something that's not going to ring the phone, but you have to, count the limited content message when it's dropped and pre-recorded. So very interesting issue.
But there is also, at least, it's not as crazy as some of the things we've seen in the past. Yes, the phone's not ringing. I'll certainly agree, and so maybe it shouldn't count. But I am leaving a message. So you sort of look at that and say, and we know, of course, they're going to come down on the consumer side. So it just seems leaving of the message. I can't say I was surprised by it. The busy signal, I agree with you. If you can't connect with the phone number dialed, and I would say a busy signal or a ringing with no pickup, you're not connecting with that number. I think that's a completely different animal. And again, it's sort of with the exception, of course, of the ringless voicemail, it's one of those things where if you're causing the phone to ring and it's ringing, that's maybe a way to think of an attempt, with the ringless voicemail being an exception to even that, so it counts. But busy signal, I mean, the phone didn't ring because they're on the other line, they're on with someone else. So it is interesting, but yeah, of all the things, and I'm not too quick to give too much credit to the Bureau, but I would say that one makes a little bit of sense. It's not as crazy as some.
So let's get to one of the things we wanted to talk about today, and that is what actually constitutes a conversation for the purposes of determining the communication caps under Regulation F. Is it as soon as the consumer picks up the phone and hellos are exchanged? Are there other rules or other criteria that collection agencies should be using to determine if they actually had a conversation? And I'll just throw it out, let anybody who wants to go first this time can go first.
Okay, I'll go first. I think this is going to be a great source of future litigation. What is a conversation? We know what a communication is. The FDCPA and Regulation F give us that definition, but it doesn't define conversation. Now, what is that? Well, I just for fun, I kind of looked around and poked around to see what is the definition of conversation. According to Merriam-Webster online, it's an oral exchange of sentiments, observations, opinions, or ideas. Okay, well, does that mean that a short hello is a conversation? Well, according to that definition, probably not. But then you look at Cambridge Dictionary online, and it says talk between two or more people. So maybe there it would be considered a conversation. There's no legal definition of conversation. Just for fun, I looked at Black's Law Dictionary. Of course, it's not defined there. So I think that this is something that we're going to have to see hashed out probably in litigation. What do you guys think?
I agree. We should check out the 11th Circuit's dictionary too while we're at it. But in any event, thinking about if we want to try to stay out of trouble, but this also means we're going to be triggering our waiting period more frequently than we want to. If you're able to identify that you have the right person, right? If you're able to say, hi, is this Lauren Valenzuela? If you're my debtor, yes. And, can you confirm my information? Yes. Hi, Lauren, I'm trying to collect from you. And you hang up on me? I'd count that. That's a pretty clear expression. But I've been thinking about, what if you say yes, but then I'm not able to verify your identity, right? Like to the way that I normally would. And how do I count that? And then factually, well, what if I called you at a number I'd previously spoken to you before? And I've seen plaintiffs' lawyers try to do this in the past in TCPA when companies were saying, well, we couldn't tell who it was. They're like, you had multiple call recordings. Why didn't you just listen and compare the voice? Which, let's be clear, that's not realistic and nobody does that. But those arguments get made. So we start wrestling with where that line is. So that's why I'm saying, I think from a compliance and litigation minimization, if you reasonably feel certain you got the right person, however you determine that internally, the rule doesn't require them to actually engage with you at all. And if you have that person and they find out who you are and hang up, I think drawing the line there is certainly a good place to start. But that means you got to wait 7 days before you can call again. Like to John's point before, this is a great opportunity, though, if you have the ability to email or text or another channel through which you can communicate with them, to go that way and see if you can get them to re-engage while you take a safer position on your 7-day waiting period.
So Stephanie, to your point, you think a conversation isn't had until you've identified and sort of confirmed the person is the right party, and then and then that's when a conversation starts.
I think that's a place where I could articulate the position clearly if I had to defend it in court, but it gets slippery if I ask for somebody and they just, I mean, to me, it would count as an attempt for sure. If I call and somebody answers, they say, hi, I'm looking for Lauren. I'm just picking on you today, Lauren. And they just hang up, right? I mean, that's definitely an attempt. But how can that translate into a communication about the debt? And don't forget that I think overlays everything to Mike's point earlier about the rule can't rewrite the statute. Statute is what it is. And you have to be communicating about the debt or communicating to find information if you're making a location call, because these contact attempt limits also apply in that context. So if I haven't been able to engage at all in that way, I don't see how it gets to being a communication to trigger. But once I start figuring out I have the right person and then disclose myself and they hang up on me, to me, that's a real clear line.
I would say, I'm
Go ahead,
sorry.
Lauren.
I was going to say the most conservative approach is probably to just treat any type of exchange with a live human as a conversation for purposes of Regulation F, but that's a very conservative approach. So I think that goes back to your risk tolerance while this kind of works itself out in the long term.
Well, there's a comment to your point, Lauren, about, well, the FDCPA is talking about communication, not conversation. I agree. But if I'm in court, you're counting it as an attempt no matter what, right? And however that has worked out within if you're calling once a day or if you're going to front load, I mean, whatever you're doing. I would much rather be in a situation where I can argue, listen, I counted it, we didn't call again, but I never was able to have a conversation about this. I wasn't even able to confirm it was the right person. How can that be a communication about the debt in a way that is different than what the rule is requiring as far as how I count and approach attempts? To me, there's an attempt to communicate, then there's communicating. If we're going to go that broad, then they're the same. They're one and the same, right? Like anytime you attempt to engage with a person, that's why I think you can defend. I'm not saying courts will agree with it. They haven't made me a judge yet. You can defend saying that what the 7-day waiting period depends on for a communication is a little bit more. Because otherwise, anytime I call you, whether you answer me or not, it's a communication, but the rule is seen fit to further segment those. So that's my thinking on that. Like I said, I don't know if the courts will buy it, but that's my thinking.
Well, and you think that, I mean, within the rule, they do use the word conversation. So, you know, conversation, communication, they've got to work together somehow. And I'm maybe not quite as conservative on this one. I think simply verifying I've got right party contact is maybe not enough, because if it's, you know, I verify I've got, I guess we're all picking on Lauren today, I've got Lauren on the phone and I feel comfortable that I've got the right person and she hangs up. I don't know that we've actually had a conversation or communicated about the debt. And so I think maybe that one step further of you start a conversation about the debt and Lauren hangs up on me. Okay, now I think we're there. And so I would go I think, a little farther than just right party contact. There has to be something more there, but it's going to be a close call. I mean, we're going to have to wait and see how this shakes out. And again, how, sometimes it's that old, how lucky do you feel? And we all know in this business, it's a tough one.
Yeah, it is, and I think it's going to get litigated, just like everything else that's here. But we're probably going to see litigation around this one fairly early, is my guess, because there isn't a really clear understanding of what this term means. And like you used the terminology right party contact, John, and why didn't they use that term? If it was really a right party conversation, why didn't they say right party conversation? And we talked earlier about the 7-7 contact attempt could include any conversation in connection with a collection of a debt. And this is the first presentation I've heard in probably 3 weeks without Hunstein mentioned, so I might as well go ahead and do that. Are we going to see that type of an argument on this issue itself? In connection with an attempt to collect a debt, and does that pull in any third party conversation that you are able to have in that period of time too? I don't know. It remains to be seen. So I think Lauren hits the nail on the head when she said the most conservative approach to this is we don't really understand it. If you don't want to be the one that's industry, that's probably the approach to take. If you're willing to go ahead and take some of those risks because you think it's going to generate revenue and you're going to be able to defend your cases, then you probably be a little bit less conservative in that approach. But
yeah, and they may be behind. I would expect the Bureau to be behind civil litigation, as we've all seen. I mean, the plaintiff's bar is going to move faster. But I would agree with you, Mike. I think that this is going to be one of the topics of very, very early Bureau examination and investigation. I'm expecting this one, and it'll be interesting because, as I say, I mean, the arguments I've been thinking of for this, having to deal with the Bureau regularly, as others do as well, is you've got to be using conversation in the context of communication. I think having a discussion with a third party absolutely gets us into the 7-7, but I don't think that's the kind of conversation that we're talking about because, I talk to the debtor's neighbor, find out they are in fact still there. So now I've verified location and I can't call the consumer my debtor for a week, for the next 7 days, doesn't make a lot of sense. And so it's going to be very interesting to see where they go. But as I say, I've tended to believe that what this is really intended to do is get you to a point that you're having some conversation actually about the debt. And that's when you have to stop for the 7-day period. It'll be interesting to see what the Bureau's interpretation really is.
That's what worries me, John, is just, and maybe it's that the Bureau doesn't yet know, right? I mean, there's a lot going on in the world and many things have to be managed and they're transitioning, but until they say something one way or the other, it's just really hard to know. And I agree, there's going to be early litigation. It would be very useful. I don't know, Mike, if these are publicly available anymore, but it would be very useful for that to be one of the FAQs that I know have been submitted that could get answered, to have guidance, not just to the industry, but to courts. And knowing what the intent was on this issue, because we don't really know. So we're in this position of having to argue, well, is it communication? Is it a conversation? Is it a conversation overlaid with communication? Like, just tell us, what was your intent, Bureau? Just tell us, did you intend us to get past RPC or not? Because judges in all the courts around the country need to know. It's really a critical piece of the puzzle, I think, here.
One thing that makes this a little bit challenging is that the rule applies also to third party calls. So if we say, okay, we're going to make our own definition of a right party contact, that only really works for a consumer communication phone attempt, but not necessarily a third party one. So I think this is where it gets real hairy. It's like, okay, how does a collection agency make sense of, how do they define conversation for both consumer and third party calls? I don't know. I don't know. I don't think any of us know either. We're just going to have to, do our best and maybe, kind of figure out where your risk is. Are you going to be more conservative? Are you going to go ahead and test the waters and just do your best, like I said, until we get more guidance?
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting total side aspects that we've not really spent much time with is, imagine the consumer calls in. I'm now at my one call, so one conversation. Assume everything goes, and we don't dispute or debate whether we're having a conversation as contemplated. All right, on an outbound call, it's pretty easy to track that I've made this call, had this conversation, don't contact them, don't make an outward attempt for the 7-day period. We need to have the technology in place to also track those inbound calls and make sure that we're not doing that. And, a lot of the systems provide and give us the opportunity to track that, but we need to be thinking about that to the extent our system doesn't, and how do we keep that particular account off of a dialer or not subject to a manual outbound call once that conversation has taken place. So that's the flip side to that.
There's an interesting question. If we have 3 possible phone numbers, but not sure if they are correct, can we only call 1 number per day? Thinking when you have multiple numbers on the account and you're not sure which one is correct, this was one of the things we were talking about before the final rule was published as part of the comment process. How after the fact, you may find out that if you were calling each, because it's not at a per number, it's per debt. It's not at the per consumer level either, but per debt. If you have 3 numbers on an account, you get 7 call attempts in 7 days. So conservative thing is count that across all the numbers. But what happens if they're bad numbers? And if you already talked about, you don't have to count. How do you find that out if you're not calling them in the first place? So it's a difficult question. And again, to Lauren's point, I'm sorry to say this, but I think you have to consider your own risk tolerance, whether, consider your data about whether having those multiple numbers, is that useful, or does it make sense to focus on a certain type of number? Does your consumer base, for whatever reason, seem to be more likely to have a home 9? Or, is there any way that you can parse it out? Or in that circumstance, have one number be the number you work on this week and use text and email separately. And then next week, another one. I understand the challenge, because if you're limiting it, you have 3 numbers, you have 2 calls per number a week, it can be challenging. But I do think the rule makes clear they don't view this on a per number basis, it's per account.
Yeah, and I guess it probably alludes to the fact that agencies have been using this technology for several years now, so it's gotten better over the years. Is really probability scoring. Not only probability to pay, but probability of the right party contact, the right phone number. And you can get a little more aggressive in what you actually accept in as phone numbers that you're willing to call. So, looking at different technologies that's available in the space, you can categorize your phone numbers that come back from skip tracing, in the ABC categories, or bucket them, and really just use high probability phone numbers, at least to start with. You can always change them out. It doesn't mean that you have to stick with that phone number forever, but you want to try to focus on the ones that are going to get you the right party contact. We all know that. So I would recommend, looking at some of those probability scoring metrics that are out there, and those, different types of data manipulation, if you will. They're really going to look at, what's the best opportunity for you, what's the best bang for your buck. So consider using that stuff to assist in this process, if you're not already.
So we'll wait for our first enforcement actions and our in the first lawsuit rulings to sort of bring in, an actual some finality to this topic of discussion, and actually what constitutes a conversation, because it seems like to me that's the only way that maybe that this is going to get resolved. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. We've used up our hour, so I want to thank Stephanie and Lauren and Mike and John for their time today on behalf of everybody watching. This was a great conversation. Really opened my eyes to some things in terms of how to comply with Regulation F. So I'm sure everybody's walking away with some great information. So on behalf of everybody watching, thank you. I really appreciate your participation. Thanks again to TCN for sponsoring today's webinar. I really appreciate their support. I dropped a link in the chat window. It should also pop up on your screen when I end the webinar to share your feedback on today's event, as well as any other ideas you want to see covered in an upcoming webinar. So feel free to shoot those over. We've got more webinars tomorrow. Tomorrow, I know we've got a whole day without talking about Hunstein, so we'll talk about it for an hour tomorrow. If you haven't signed up for that one, there's a link in the events calendar on accountsrecovery.net. You can check that one out as well as some of the other events that are coming up in the coming days. Hope to see you back there. So until then, everybody, thank you very much, panel. Thank you. Great job. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.
Take care.